9 months after we buried my daughter, an electric bill for her lake house arrived at my address. A house that was padlocked, dark since the day of the funeral, gate chained, nobody in it. And that bill said 2,940 kilowatt hours in 1 month. That is roughly 3 times what a family of 4 burns through living in a house full time. If you ever did the work I did, you already know what that means. It isn't a few lights. It isn't a refrigerator somebody forgot to unplug. It's something very large running inside that house, for weeks, maybe months. And here's the part that keeps me up. It isn't the bill. It's that I paid those bills myself. For 9 months, and I never read a single line. I looked at the amount. I signed the check. I filed it away. That is a mistake a man like me is never supposed to make. My name is Coy Rutledge. I'm 64 years old, and I've lived in Huntsville, Alabama since 1981. I spent 29 years doing revenue protection for a regional electric utility. Now, most people have never heard that job title, so here's what it is. When somebody steals power, bypasses a meter, taps a service drop, runs an illegal load, I'm the man they send. And the thing everybody assumes about that work is wrong, so let me tell you the truth about it. I never once caught anybody by looking at a person. Not one time in 29 years. People are good. People are extremely plausible. A man will stand in his own driveway and explain something to you with his hand on your shoulder, and you will believe every syllable of it, and he'll be lying the entire time, and you will not be able to tell. What you catch them with is the number, because the meter does not know the story. That's the sentence they taught me in 1,996 inches, a training room in Chattanooga, and I have said it out loud probably 400 times since. The meter doesn't know the story. It doesn't care who died. It doesn't care what anybody's going through. It records what actually happened, in 15-minute intervals, forever, and it cannot be talked to. 29 years of that. I could read a load profile the way some men read a face. Hold that, because I'm going to tell you how I stopped. My daughter was Rosalind. Everybody called her Rosie. She was 31. She died in April, at home, in her sleep, and there was no warning of any kind. An arrhythmia nobody knew she had. She went to bed on a Tuesday, and she did not get up on Wednesday. 31 years old. Her mother was Retta. I lost Retta 7 years before that, breast cancer, and it took 2 years, and I had time to get ready for that one, whatever that means. I did not have time for Rosie. Nobody does. Her husband called me at 7:10 that Wednesday morning. Chance Fant. And I want to describe how his voice sounded on that phone because I have thought about it about 1,000 times since. It was flat. Completely flat. Like a man reading off a card. And I drove 90 minutes with my hands at 10 and 2 and did not turn the radio on. And when I got there, Chance came off that porch and put his head on my shoulder and came apart. And I held my son-in-law up in a driveway in Madison County for about 4 minutes while he shook. And I told myself that grief comes out sideways on some people, and that a man's voice being flat on a telephone is not evidence of anything. I still think that's true. That's the trouble. I still think that's true. The cabin was Rosie's. Retta and I bought it in 2003, when Rosie was 11 two-bedrooms on Cottonwood Point out on Lake Guntersville, cedar siding, a dock, and a screened porch that catches the wind off the water in August, which anybody who has spent an August in North Alabama will tell you is not a small thing. When Retta died, I signed the deed straight over to Rosie, free and clear, no note on it, her inheritance, and I did it in 2018 because I wanted her to have it while she was young enough to use it. She and Chance spent every summer down there. She fished off that dock. She used to send me photographs of the sunset over the water with no caption, just the picture, maybe 40 times a summer. After she died, Chance told me he couldn't go back there. He said the memories were too much. He said he'd chain the gate and shut the water off at the meter, and he'd deal with it when he could stand to. I believed him completely, and I want to be clear that I would believe him again, because that is exactly what a man in his position would say. The mail started forwarding to me about 6 weeks after the funeral. The estate wasn't settled. I was named co-administrator with Chance, so the accounts were still in Rosie's name, and Chance asked if the paperwork could come to me because he was drowning and couldn't face it. I said of course. And for 9 months I got an envelope every month, and I opened it, and I looked at the amount, and I wrote a check, and I put it in a folder. $12, meter maintenance, on an inactive account. 16 1 month. and I did not read one single one of them. Now I want to sit in that for a minute, because it's the actual center of this whole thing. I spent 29 years being the man who reads the document. That was the entire job. Other people look at the amount. I looked at the times pattern. I have testified in court about a bar chart, and for 9 months I signed checks for my dead daughter's cabin without looking at anything but the number in the box. Because opening that envelope properly, sitting down with it, actually looking at it, would have meant thinking about her, and I could not do that at a kitchen table at 7 in the morning with the coffee going. So I processed it. That's the honest word. I processed my daughter's mail for 9 months so I wouldn't have to read it. If you have ever handled somebody's paperwork after they died, and a lot of you have, you know exactly what I'm describing. There's a way to do it where your hands do the work, and you keep your eyes about 6 inches to the left of what you're holding. Everybody does it. Nobody talks about it. That's how a man like me misses a thing like this. January the 9th. I remember because it was cold enough that I'd had the truck plugged in. I opened the envelope and I looked at the box, and the box said $847 and something. And my hand stopped. And then, for the first time in 9 months, I actually turned the page over. There's a chart at the bottom of every one of those statements. 12 little bars, one for each month of the year, so you can see your usage. Nobody looks at it. I have been in 100 and some kitchens in my career, and I have never once seen a customer who looked at that chart. 11 bars down at the bottom, all about the same. Nothing. Base load, which is what an empty building draws a meter, and whatever's plugged in that nobody unplugged. And then December, 2,940 kilowatt hours. I want you to understand what that means, because the dollar figure is not the thing. The dollar figure just makes you flinch. A typical house in North Alabama, occupied, family in it, running heat in December, that's 1,100, maybe 1,300. 2,940 in a padlocked cabin with the water off at the street. There is something in that building running 24 hours a day, and it is big, and it has been on for at least a month. I sat at that table for a long time, long enough that the coffee went cold, which I noticed later. And here's what I did not do, and it's the most important decision in this entire story. I did not call chance. 29 years in that job teaches you exactly one operational rule, and it is this. The moment you announce yourself to the problem, the evidence starts leaving. Every single time. I've had customers pull a bypass out of a meter can in the 90 minutes between a phone call and a truck rolling. I have watched a man on a ladder from 300 yards away, undoing his own theft while my truck came up the road. You do not knock. You look first. So I folded that statement, put it in my shirt pocket, got in the truck, and drove south. It's an hour and 50 minutes from my house to that cabin. I've made that drive probably 400 times, and I want to tell you what I did on the way, because it's what I've always done, and it's the only thing that kept me steady. I built a list, out loud, in the truck. Possibility 1, a failed hack unit stuck on, compressor locked, running full time, drawing everything it can pull. That happens. That's a real thing, and it accounts for a big number. Possibility 2, a squatter. It gets cold. The property's obviously empty. Somebody's running space heaters. Possibility 3. A miss, read, or a swapped meter number. That's about 2% of what I used to work. Possibility 4 is the one I did not say out loud in the truck. I turned off County Road 67, and I did not take the driveway. There's an old hunting track that runs along the north tree line. Deer camp trucks use it in the fall. I put the truck up in there behind a stand of pine about 250 yards out and walked the rest. And when the trees broke and I could see the property, I stopped where I was. Now I want to slow all the way down. The cabin itself was dark. Chained gate, exactly like he said. Shutters closed. There was leaf litter on the porch, steps a foot deep and undisturbed, which is a detail I noted and which turned out to matter because it meant nobody was using the front door. But the outbuilding was not dark. That building is 24 by 16. I know its dimensions because I helped Chance frame it in the summer of 2021. We put it up in 9 days, the two of us, and Rosie brought sandwiches out at noon and made fun of both of us for the way we were arguing about the roof pitch. We ran a sub-panel to it, 40 amps, for a table saw and some lights. Every window in that building was covered from the inside with black sheeting, and around the edges of that sheeting, all 4 windows, was a hard, even line of light. Not a lamp, not a work light, that white-blue continuous kind that doesn't flicker, and on the outside wall, running up from the ground and in through the soffit, there was conduit that I did not put there. I know what I put on that building. I stood on a ladder and put it there myself. That was new service. Somebody had brought in a considerably larger feed, and they had brought it in on the back side, away from the road, and there was a mini-split condenser sitting on a pad beside it that had not existed in 2021. I stood in that tree line for about 40 minutes. Nothing moved. No vehicle I could see, though the drive curves behind the building and I couldn't see all of it. And I want to tell you what I was actually thinking, because it was not what you'd expect. I was doing the arithmetic. Because I knew the amperage on that panel and I could see the condenser and I could see the light, and I stood in the cold with my breath going, and I calculated the load, and I got somewhere around $2,800 a month, which was within about 5% of the number on the paper in my shirt pocket. That's what my head does. It ran the numbers on my daughter's property while I stood there. And then it stopped doing that, and I put my hand on a pine tree, and I stood there for a while longer. I walked back to the truck, and I sat in it with the engine off, and then I called Chance. Now this call is the one I'd play for you if I could. He answered on the third ring, with that voice he'd had for 9 months. Soft, tired, a little bit far away, and I told him a version of the truth that was designed to give him every possible way out. I said I'd been going through the forwarded mail and there was a power bill for the cabin that looked high. I said I figured it was probably a heat pump stuck in a cycle, or a water heater element gone, or something that had been left plugged in. I said I had time on my hands and I was thinking about running down there and having a look, and that I didn't want him to have to deal with one more thing. And then I shut up, and I listened. And there was a pause. 2 seconds. Maybe 2.5. Now, everybody pauses on a phone. That's not a finding by itself, and I want to be fair about that. But I have spent 29 years standing in people's yards asking them about their meters, and I have run about 1,100 of those conversations. And I am telling you that a man with nothing to hide answers a question about his electric bill in times 0 times seconds. 0. It's not even a topic. It's a bill. 2 seconds is a man deciding which version to give. And then he gave it to me, and it was good. I'll say that for him. It was a good one. He said he was sorry. He should have told me. He said he'd hired a local fellow back in the fall to keep an eye on the place, run the heat periodically so the pipes didn't freeze, check on things after storms. Man named Gary, through a neighbor. He said it had probably been running more than it needed to, and he'd get on it. He said, "Coy, I should have said something. Everything's just been a lot." And I said, "Chance, that makes perfect sense. I'm relieved it's simple." And I told him good night. And I sat in that truck in the dark, and here is exactly what was wrong with that story. And it's 3 things. 1. The water was off at the street. He told me that himself in April, and I'd confirmed it on the account. You do not run heat to keep pipes from freezing in a building with no water in the pipes. 2. Nobody in Marshall County is winterizing anything in October. We had 2 nights below freezing all last winter. 3. And this is the one. A man running a heater does not cover 4 windows, with black sheeting from the inside. I stayed out there in that truck for another hour, and I took photographs from the tree line with my phone, and then I drove home and got there at 1 in the morning. And then I went into the back bedroom, which I call an office because it has a filing cabinet in it, and I pulled Rosie's estate folder, and I started reading. I read until it got light. The first thing I found was an account amendment filed with the power company in July, 3 months after the funeral. The service address was upgraded. Someone had requested and received a service capacity increase on that property in July, and the request had been made under Rosie's account, which was still in Rosie's name, and the authorization had been signed by the surviving spouse as co-administrator, which is technically legal, and which I, as the other times co-administrator, was supposed to be notified about, and which I was not, because the notification went to the address on file, and the address on file had been changed twice. And the second thing I found was worse. I went to the county's online records because I couldn't sleep, and I typed in the parcel number. There was a mortgage on it, $185,000, recorded in June, 9 weeks after I buried my daughter. The property she inherited from her mother, that I signed over to her free and clear in 2018, was encumbered for $185,000 before her headstone was set. 9 weeks. I want to be honest about what happened to me at that desk, because I have never told anybody, and I'm going to tell you. It was not the money. I want to say that plainly. It has never once been about the money, and I have not needed money since 2009. It was that I sat there and I did the calendar. 9 weeks after the funeral is the second week of June. And I knew exactly what I was doing in the second week of June, because I have it written down. I was at that cabin on the 11th and 12th, cleaning out the refrigerator and boxing up her clothes, because Chance said he couldn't do it, and I said I would. I spent 2 days folding my daughter's shirts into boxes. And somewhere in that same stretch, that man sat in an office and signed a note against that building. That's the part, not the 185,000. Those 2 days. I called 2 people that morning. The first was Ida Bellamy, who drafted Rosie's will, and who has been doing estate work in this county since 1989. She's 62, about 5 feet tall, and I once watched her take apart a bank's trust officer in a conference room without ever getting above conversational volume. She listened to all of it without saying one word, which took about 11 minutes. And then she said, "Coy, send me the photographs. Do not go back on that property. Do not call him again." I said, "Why not call him?" She said, "Because right now he thinks you believed him. That is worth more than anything you could say to him." The second call was to Sonny Bevel. Sonny did 22 years with the Marshall County Sheriff's Office and now does private work out of a little office in Guntersville. I've known him since 2003, back when he'd call me in as a technical witness on insurance jobs, usually somebody who'd staged an electrical fire and done a poor job of it. We met at a place off the highway the next morning and I put everything on the table. He read for a long time and wrote in a notebook and did not talk. Then he looked up and he said, "Coy, I need to ask you something and I need a straight answer. Do you actually want to know?" And I said, "Say that again." And he said, "Some people want the number explained. Some people want to know. Those are different jobs, and the second one you can't undo." I said, "I want to know." He said, "Give me 4 days and stay off that property." 4 days is a long time when you are 64 years old sitting in a house by yourself with a folder on the desk. I used them. Ida and I went through every document that estate had produced since April. And on the 3rd day I found the invoice. Contractor invoice, dated 7 weeks after the funeral, for seasonal property maintenance at the Cottonwood Point address, $3,150. Paid out of the estate account, which I co-administered, which means it was paid with money that was in part my daughter's estate, which means I signed off on it in a stack on a Tuesday without reading it. And the name on that invoice was Verley Dozier. I didn't know it then. I know it now. Sonny called on the 4th morning. He'd been in that tree line 3 nights. And he told me, in that flat way he has, that the outbuilding had been converted into a commercial-scale indoor cultivation operation, not a few plants. A built-out room, professionally done, with the ventilation and the electrical to match, and he estimated it had been producing for at least 2 cycles. He said it was not somebody's hobby. He said the money in a setup that size is real money, and it runs into 6 figures a year. And then he said, "There's 2 people going in and out." Chance was there 2 or 3 nights a week, and a second vehicle, regular, registered to a woman named Verley Dozier. Sonny had run her. 2 convictions, both from her 20s, both drug-related, both pled down, nothing in 14 years. And she had been the office manager at Chance's pool company for 4 years. And I sat at my kitchen table with the invoice in front of me and understood that they had used my dead daughter's estate to pay the woman who was helping build it, and that I had signed the check. I am not a man who raises his voice. My ex-wife Retta used to say I ran cold, and she did not entirely mean it as a compliment. But I sat there with that invoice, and something came up through me that I had felt exactly one other time, which was standing in a driveway in Madison County in April holding a man up while he cried. And the thing that came up was grief, and it did not have a bottom in it. And sitting right on top of the grief, cold and completely steady, was something else, and I did not intend to waste 1 ounce of it. Ida said we had to move fast, because the estate was still open, and if Chance moved to close it or transfer the property before we established fraud, our footing got a lot worse. She needed 48 hours for an emergency freeze, and she said she was going to make a phone call to somebody she'd worked with on a financial case in 2019 who was now with a federal task force. I said make it, and then I said, in the meantime I need him comfortable. because he had to keep believing I was exactly what he had always taken me for, a quiet old man who'd retired from the power company and who'd swallowed the story about Gary the handyman. So on the Thursday I drove up to his house with a pot roast. That's what I used to bring in the weeks after the funeral, back when I thought I was bringing food to a man who was hollowed out. He came to the door in a flannel shirt with his hair every which way, doing that version of himself he'd been doing for 9 months, and he was genuinely glad to see me. I'd stake money on that. We sat in that living room and talked about Rosie the way we always did, carefully, going around the edges. And I watched his hands. And then I said, like it had just come to me, that I'd been thinking about doing some work at the cabin over the winter. Nothing big. I said I wanted to redo the drainage on the south side where it washes, and that while I was at it I'd probably pull that sub-panel out of the outbuilding and put in something with more room in it, since we'd undersized it in 2021. And I watched him. His shoulders came down about 1/4 of an inch, and his hand tightened on that glass of tea, not a grab, just a change of grip. And he said, "That's real thoughtful, Coy, but you don't need to be doing that." He said Gary had it handled. He said he'd hate for me to drive all that way for nothing. He said wait till spring, when the weather's better. I said that made good sense. I got in my truck, and I sat in his driveway for a second before I backed out, and I thought, 9 months. 9 months of pot roast and careful conversation and going around the edges. I called Sonny from the highway and told him the property was being actively protected from inspection. The task force moved 11 days later. Sonny had watched loading activity start on a Wednesday night, which meant a handoff, which meant both of them on site. He called me at 5:40 on the Friday morning and said they were staging and that I could come to the perimeter or wait for a call, entirely my choice. I put on a coat and poured coffee into a travel mug and drove south in the dark. Now I want to slow all the way down, because this is the longest part of this story, and it took about 2 hours, and I have gone over every minute of it. I got to the turnoff at 8:50 in the morning. They were already in. 3 dark SUVs and a van up on that same hunting track I'd parked on in January, which I found grimly funny at the time and still do. An agent walked me to the van and I stood inside it in a coat that was not warm enough and watched a monitor. There was a drone up, and on that screen the outbuilding was a white rectangle with 2 shapes moving inside it. 2 heat signatures, both moving, both there. And I stood in a federal surveillance van at 64 years old looking at a thermal image of my daughter's backyard, and here is what was going through my head, and it was not the arrest. It was the roof pitch. Chance and I argued about the pitch on that building for 2 days in July of 2021. He wanted a 412 because it was easier, and I wanted a 6 because of the leaf load off those water oaks. And Rosie came out with sandwiches on the second day and told us we were both idiots and that she was going to hire somebody. We built it at a 5. Split the difference. She thought that was hilarious. I framed the building he did it in. That is the thing I have not been able to put down and I don't expect to. They went at 9:41. I did not watch the monitor. I stepped out of that van and stood in the tree line in the cold, and I listened. You can hear a lot from 200 yards in November when the leaves are down. I heard them announce. I heard the door, that particular sound a door makes when it goes all at once. I heard voices going over each other, and then one voice high and fast, and then that one stopped, and then it was just the commands and the movement and one metallic sound I recognized. Under 4 minutes, start to finish. They brought Chance out in a gray sweatshirt with his hands behind him and his head down. He did not look toward the trees. There was no reason for him to. I watched a man I helped frame a building with get walked across my daughter's yard. Verley Dozier came out about 90 seconds later, already talking fast, to whichever agent was nearest, which Sonny told me afterward is the single most common thing that happens, and almost never helps. And then I walked out of those trees and stood in the driveway, which I want to describe, because it's the part I actually remember. It was quiet. That's the thing nobody tells you. After all that, it went completely quiet inside about 10 minutes, and there were vehicles and people going in and out of a building, and none of them were saying anything much, and the lake was right there. Gray and flat the way it gets in November, and that dock going out into it. An agent came over and handed me a document, an emergency injunction, already signed, freezing every transaction connected to the estate and the property. And she told me 2 things, that what was in the building was more than enough, and that their financial people had already flagged the mortgage, and that the $185,000 was going to be clawed back as part of the recovery. I thanked her, and then I walked down to the end of that dock and stood there for a while. Rosie used to sit out there at 6 in the morning with her coffee. She told me once she was maybe 24 that it was the only place she'd ever been where her head went quiet. I stood at the end of it in the cold and I said a few things to my daughter that I'm not going to repeat. The rest of it went faster than I expected. Chance took a plea and cooperated, which is what people do, and his cooperation led to 4 more arrests in 2 states, because the operation on my daughter's property was one of 3 properties feeding the same distribution. He got 9 years. Verley Dozier went to trial and got 14, which is more than him, which I have opinions about that I'll get to. Ida spent 5 months unwinding everything. The mortgage was voided as fraudulently obtained. A portion of the draw came back through seizure. The $3,150 paid to Verley Dozier out of the estate was reversed and reimbursed out of Chance's seized accounts, which took the longest, and which mattered to me more than the rest of it put together. And when the estate finally settled, that cabin came to me. Now here's the part I have to do. I want to tell you about Chance Fant, and I want to be fair, and being fair about that man cost me something, and I'm going to do it anyway. His business was failing before Rosie died. That came out in discovery. 2 bad seasons, a truck note, 2 equipment notes, and 11 months of covering payroll on a line of credit that was at its limit by February. And he had not told her, not one word. 18 months of coming home and lying to my daughter every single evening about how the year was going. And then she died, with no warning, at 31. And he was standing there holding a debt she never knew existed, and a paid-off building she'd left him outright, and an office manager who'd been through her own ruin and who had a way to make it work. And here's the uncomfortable part. His grief was real. I have thought about this for a year, and I have landed there and I can't get off it. That was not a performance on my porch in April. He loved my daughter. I watched them for 8 years. What happened is that grief and desperation ran through the same man in the same month, and he found out that the first one was extremely good cover for the second, and once you've used it that way one time, you can't stop, because stopping means explaining. His lawyer read a statement at sentencing, and there was one line in it that I believe was true. He said he intended to put all of it back before anybody knew, which is what every single person who has ever taken money they shouldn't have has believed, sincerely, on the day they took it. And Verley Dozier, 14 years. 2 convictions from her 20s, nothing since. 4 years running that man's front office for $14 an hour, which I know because it was in the filings, because there is not a company in this state that will hire a woman with her record for anything above that. She got 14 years and he got 9 because he had something to trade and she didn't, and I have thought about that more than is probably good for me. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for either one of them. There was a commercial operation running in a building I framed with my own hands on my dead daughter's land, and it was paid for with a mortgage taken out while I was folding her clothes into boxes. But I've been in this long enough to know that almost nobody wakes up one morning and decides to be a criminal. What happens is that somebody gets into a hole with no legitimate way out of it, and then somebody offers them a way, and the offer arrives on the worst week of their life. I tore that outbuilding down to the slab in March. Every bit of it. I did it myself with a sledge and a sawzall over about 3 weeks, and I did not enjoy 1 minute of it. Then I rebuilt it. 24 by 16, same footprint, and I put a 612 pitch on it because I was right in 2021, and Rosie's not here to overrule me. I did the drainage on the south side. I put in the panel I told Chance I was going to put in, and I've got that statement, the $847, with the bar chart on the back in a frame on the wall of that shop. Not because I'm proud of it, because of what's on the back of it. So here's what all this taught me, and it's the thing I told other people for 29 years, and stopped doing for 9 months. The meter doesn't know the story. Everybody in this thing was plausible. Chance was plausible for 9 months. He was plausible on my porch, and plausible on the telephone, and plausible with a glass of tea in his hand. I could not tell. I want that on the record, because a lot of people watching this are going to think they'd have known, and I'm telling you as a professional that you would not have. Nobody can read a person. That is a thing we tell ourselves. What you can read is a number, and a number cannot perform grief. It cannot look tired. It cannot put its head on your shoulder in a driveway. It just records what actually happened, and it does it every 15 minutes, and it does not care what anybody says. And I let 9 months go by without looking at one, because looking at it properly would have meant sitting still with my daughter's name on a piece of paper, and I could not do that at 7 in the morning. That's the whole failure. It isn't that I was fooled. It's that I stopped reading. So here's the one thing I'd ask you to actually do, and it takes 4 minutes, 4 times a year, and it is free. Look at the graph, not the total. Every utility bill, every bank statement, every card statement now has a chart on it, 12 little bars. And I promise you that you have never once looked at it, because nobody does. Everybody looks at the amount and whether they can cover it. The amount tells you what happened this month. The times shape times tells you what changed. 4 times a year. Set a reminder. Pull up the 12-month graph on everything and just look at the shape of it. And this part especially, if it applies to you. If you are administering an estate, or handling things for a parent, or responsible for a property that's sitting empty, pull the 12-month usage on every utility at that address. It's on the account portal. It costs nothing. It takes 90 seconds. An empty building draws a flat line. Flat and low, month after month, and it's the most boring picture you will ever look at. And if it is not flat, then somebody is in there. That's it. That's the whole thing. That is the entire lesson of 29 years, and it fits on one line. And I had it, and I didn't use it, because it came in an envelope with my daughter's name on it. And the question I sit with, most nights, what am I currently paying without reading, because reading it would mean sitting still with something I can't stand to sit still with. Everybody's got one. Mine was in a folder in a filing cabinet for 9 months. Now I want to hear from you, because I have gone back and forth on parts of this, and I'd like to know what you think. Comment 1 if you think I did right driving down without calling, taking the photographs, and building it with a lawyer and an investigator before anybody knew I was looking. Comment 2 if you think I should have picked up the phone that first morning and asked him straight out, face to face, and given the man one honest chance to tell me before I went around him. And comment 3 if you think I should have called the sheriff from that tree line in January instead of running 3 weeks of my own operation on my dead daughter's property. Number 2 is the one I turn over, because there's a version of that January morning where I drive to his house instead of the cabin, and I don't know what happens in that version, and I never will. And tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are right now. It's about 9:30 here, and it's warm for March, and it still gets me that somebody's hearing an old power company man talk while they're eating breakfast on the other side of the world. And here's the one I really want. If you've ever handled somebody's paperwork after they died, and I know a lot of you have, tell me whether you actually read it, or whether you did what I did, which is process it with your hands while keeping your eyes 6 inches to the left. You don't have to say who. I just want to know I'm not the only one. Because I signed 9 months of checks for my daughter and I never once turned the page over. If this one reached you, stay with me and subscribe. It's an old man in Huntsville with a microphone, a shop with a 612 pitch on it, and a framed electric bill on the wall. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Huntsville to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.